The engines murmured with a steady hum, that particular low thrum that coaxed most travelers into restless sleep, but not him. Flight 721 was deep into its transatlantic arc, slicing silently through layers of cloud under a starless sky. Its destination, Grünwald, a quiet alpine city tucked beyond the Swiss border. The cabin lights had dimmed into a muted aquamarine, stretching long shadows down the center aisle. A brief ripple of turbulence caused untouched drinks to rattle in their holders, the ice cubes tapping like distant glass chimes. In seat 17B, Jonas Creel sat motionless, not drowsy, not tense, just still. His eyes weren't shut, nor were they actively scanning. They simply watched, the way someone watches the horizon by a campfire, not for comfort, but to see what might emerge from the dark. Years of high-threat assignments had taught him the paradox that real alertness often mimicked calm. He wore a soft cotton button-up, open at the collar. No gadgets, no luxury watch, no headphones, just a man in his late 60s, silent, unreadable, with scarred knuckles resting loosely on the tray in front of him. To a casual glance, he might have been mistaken for a professor or a retired engineer headed to the mountains for leisure. Nothing in his body language indicated readiness. And yet, every tendon and muscle beneath the fabric remained quietly coiled. There was a weight in the air tonight, heavier than usual. Jonas had flown more than most military pilots in his time and knew the mechanical rhythm of a well-operating aircraft. But something about this flight felt off, a barely there dissonance he couldn't quite define, but one he recognized. A gentle voice broke the hush. "Would you care for some coffee, sir?" The flight attendant's words were soft, her movement precise, as she placed a ceramic cup onto his tray. Wisps of steam curled into the ambient cabin light before disappearing. Her name tag read Miralenko, early 20s, quiet poise, Eastern European features, maybe Moldovan, possibly Slovak. Her hand trembled just slightly as she released the cup. She lingered half a beat longer than needed. Her grip on the beverage cart was stiff, knuckles blanching. Jonas didn't look at her. Not right away. His gaze shifted instead to the cup itself, tilting it slightly. The way she'd angled it toward him wasn't random. It was intentional. There, just under the lip of the porcelain, a faint line of smudged ink shimmered through the glaze. It was rushed, barely legible. "Please, help row 11 acting strange." He inhaled slowly, eyes steady. No reaction on his face. Lightning flashed beyond the oval window beside him, illuminating the clouds below like ghostly peaks in a submerged world. Then he reached forward, fingers curling around the cup. One sip, measured, controlled. The coffee was overly bitter, clearly left on the galley burner too long. He set it down with the same precision he'd learned during covert ops, brushing the base lightly, acknowledging the message without acknowledgment. Only then did he raise his gaze, not toward Mira, but past her, down the aisle, toward the cockpit. The door remained closed. It had not opened once since departure. Not for a restroom break, not for protocol checks with the crew. His jaw flexed slightly, almost nothing. But after 4 decades in high-risk zones, Jonas knew one immutable truth. The most dangerous threats rarely looked dangerous at all. Miralenko had been flying international legs for just under a month. At 24, she was the youngest crew member on tonight's manifest, a detail her supervisor had pointed out twice during briefing, not as a warning, just as context. Most cabin crew served at least a year on domestic routes before getting assigned red-eye intercontinental flights. But Nimbus Air had staffing issues. Mira had ranked high in both poise and judgment during training. Now, As she moved quietly through the cabin, collecting empty glasses, her gaze flitted again to row 11, and the man in 11A. He had buzzed his call button 4 separate times in the last 60 minutes. Every request had been innocuous. An extra pillow, a second water, asking how long was left until landing. His boarding pass read, Colin Brayer, 36, finance sector. But something didn't add up. The way his fingers kept tapping his thigh in irregular patterns. The perspiration along his brow, even though the air was kept cool. The too attentive way he watched her, only to dart his eyes away whenever she met his gaze. Something was wrong. She'd mentioned it to Rena, the senior attendant. The older woman had nodded and said quietly, "Monitor him. Don't spook. He's probably a nervous flyer." It was standard advice. Protocol discouraged profiling based on tension alone. Flight anxiety was common. Intent wasn't. But Mira knew this wasn't fear. She'd seen fear in passengers before. This was calculation. As she passed row 17 again, her attention momentarily shifted back to the silent man in 17D. He hadn't said a word since boarding, didn't request a blanket or snacks, didn't plug into the in-flight entertainment. He simply observed. There was a quiet control to him. The way he barely moved, the way he seemed to notice everything without directly looking. He reminded her of her grandfather, Mattia, a stern border guard who'd once kept an entire outpost running on instinct alone. Jonas had the same kind of presence, the type who knew down to the step how long it would take to reach the exit, who in the room had weapons, what objects could be used if things went sideways. And yet, what worried Mira even more than the man in 11A, was the cockpit. They were nearly 5 hours into the flight. Not once had either pilot emerged. Not for a stretch. Not to check in with crew. Not for a routine systems confirmation. On transatlantic journeys, that kind of radio silence wasn't just unusual. It was wrong. She smiled professionally as she passed passengers, but her gut twisted. She'd done gymnastics competitively growing up, and this felt exactly like that half-second before a fall. The pause when you're still in the air, knowing something's about to go wrong. He hadn't touched the touchscreen in the seat back. No movies, no map, no headphones. Jonas Creel simply sat there, quiet and motionless, observing everything through the corners of his eyes. Where other passengers blurred together in Mira's mind after enough flights, this man didn't. There was something in the way he moved, or rather, how little he moved. Every gesture was minimal, efficient, every glance subtle, precise. His stillness wasn't laziness. It was measured, calculated. Mira had seen it once before. In her uncle Mattia Lenko, a former border enforcer turned private security consultant. He had once entered a building and, with one scan of the room, could tell you how many steps to the nearest exit, who had a concealed weapon, and which chair could be used to break a lock. Jonas gave off the same quiet command, the kind of presence that warned you he wasn't just watching for trouble. He was waiting for it. But it wasn't Jonas that kept tugging at the back of her mind. It was that sealed cockpit. They were almost 5 hours into the flight now. Neither the captain nor the co-pilot had stepped out once. Not for a walk, not for a restroom break, not even to check in with the crew about the meal cart schedule. Protocol demanded cockpit rotation on international routes. One pilot rested while the other flew, then switched. That process helped avoid fatigue, kept situational awareness sharp. But tonight, no one had moved. The door remained shut. Mira walked the aisle in practiced rhythm, smile in place, movements calm, but tension bloomed in her core. Like a pulled muscle, she knew this feeling. The same twisting, hovering anxiety she used to feel at the peak of her beam routines, just before gravity decided the outcome. Back in seat 17B, Jonas shifted a small metal spoon in his hand, subtly angling it to reflect the space behind him. An old trick, but one that had saved his life more than once. It gave him a wide-angle glance of the cabin without ever turning his head, just enough to track patterns, movements, inconsistencies. He saw Colin Brayer, the man in 11A, clearly now. Late 30s, expensive timepiece, budget blazer. He kept checking his phone, though it was supposedly in airplane mode. Or was it? From this distance, Jonas couldn't be certain. Colin's leg bounced with a perfect anxious rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. The kind of restlessness that came from one of two things: raw nerves or mental preparation. Either he was terrified, or he was about to act. Jonas's right hand remained loose on the tray table. Occasionally, he lifted the coffee cup in a show of casual movement. His left hand, hidden under the airline blanket, clenched the armrest tightly, his knuckles ghost white beneath the fabric. His body had long been conditioned for dual modes: surface-level ease, underlying readiness. He could appear completely relaxed while simultaneously mapping the fastest path to disarm a threat. His eyes flicked briefly upward. The overhead camera, installed just outside the cockpit door for security purposes, should have had a faint green indicator. On meant live, off meant offline. It was off, dark. Someone had disabled it. That wasn't just wrong, it was against every regulation in the book. Disabling that camera required access and intent. His gaze returned to the coffee cup. The message, scrawled in blue ink, was already fading beneath the sheen of condensation. Mira had sharp instincts. That much was clear. She'd seen something. She'd taken a risk. But Jonas was no longer convinced the man in 11A was the real concern. He was twitchy. Yes, sweaty, unsettled, tense. But Jonas had seen dozens of nervous flyers. Fear wasn't danger. It was distraction. What truly gnawed at him was the silence from the front of the plane, that unbroken, sterile quiet behind the cockpit door, the kind of stillness that felt staged. He took another sip, expression unchanged. To anyone watching, he was just another bleary-eyed traveler, riding the tail end of jet lag with a too-bitter brew. But his mind? It was racing, charting possibilities, ranking threats, reviewing tactical angles like a grandmaster counting backward from checkmate. He wasn't worried about Colin. He was worried about what lay beyond that door. The time on the screen in front of him read 2:17 a.m. Outside, the plane cruised over the vast darkness of the ocean, untouched by moonlight. Inside, the cabin had quieted into that heavy, middle-of-the-night hush. Most passengers were asleep. A few dozed under blankets. The overhead lights looked like stars hanging low in an artificial sky. Jonas rose from his seat with slow, calculated movements, stretching, as if easing stiff joints. His footsteps down the aisle were silent and precise, honed from years of training. Every step had purpose. As he passed row 11, he glanced sideways. Colin was hunched over, fumbling with his carry-on bag. His hands shook. His breathing was uneven, shallow. Sweat coated his forehead like morning dew. His gaze bounced between the bag, his watch, and the aisle. "Need a hand?" Jonas asked, his voice low, smooth, offering help without pressure. Colin jumped slightly, almost dropping the zipper in his hand. "No, I'm good," he said too fast. "Just looking for meds." Jonas nodded, reaching up as if to adjust the overhead bin, but his real goal was to glimpse inside the open carry-on. A flicker of papers, clothes, prescription bottles. No wires, no suspicious tech, no weapons. Just mess. mess, and meds. Their eyes met for the first time. Jonas saw it instantly. Not the focused, empty calm of a man preparing to harm others, but the panicked, glassy confusion of someone trying not to fall apart, a man trying to act normal and failing. Colin wasn't planning anything. He was unraveling. Anxiety? Withdrawal? Fear? Jonas moved on toward the rear lavatory, his suspicion diffused. As he passed the galley, he caught Mira's eye. He gave her the smallest shake of his head. Not him, but the real threat? Still behind that locked door. Colin's hands fumbled with the edge of the bag, nearly dropping it as Jonas Creel spoke. No, I'm fine," he stammered, breath short, then added quickly, "Just grabbing my medication." Jonas gave a nod and a polite smile, lifting a hand to the overhead bin, as if assisting with luggage. The movement was fluid, natural, nothing out of place, but it allowed him a quick glance into the bag's interior. His eyes moved faster than most people's thoughts, sorting, identifying, eliminating. No electronics, no wires, no disassembled weapons, no sign of hidden devices. Just a tangle of personal effects, crumpled documents, and a trio of orange prescription bottles with partially visible pharmacy labels. Colin looked up, and for the first time, their eyes locked. Jonas saw it instantly. Not aggression, not cold calculation, just the trembling fog of a man barely holding himself together. His hands weren't shaking from tension before an attack. They were shaking from chemical need. His constant glances at his watch weren't timing anything sinister. They were counting the seconds until he could take his next dose. Colin wasn't a threat to anyone. He was a man spiraling under the weight of withdrawal, trying to survive a long-haul flight with no access to his usual routine. Jonas had seen that look before, on operatives forced into the field too soon, on young soldiers trying to stay functional after trauma, on men who looked tough until the pain wore them down. Colin's attempt at normal was a mask stretched too thin. With his assessment complete, Jonas moved toward the lavatory. Quiet, calm, his instincts confirmed. As he passed the galley, he made brief eye contact with Miralenko. No words were exchanged, just a slight shake of his head, so small it could have been missed by anyone not watching closely. Not him. The real danger hadn't called for water or requested a pillow. It was still locked behind that cockpit door. And the more time passed, the more Jonas's certainty grew. Something was deeply wrong up front. Back in seat 17B, Jonas reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. Not the one that held credit cards and boarding passes. This one was older, thinner, worn from years of disuse. It hadn't seen daylight in a decade. He opened it slowly, shielding it from sight with the curve of his body. Inside, tucked behind a faded security clearance card and 2 foreign bills, was an identification badge, its edges soft from time and travel. The hologram across the top had dulled, but the text was still legible. So was the emblem in the corner, a stylized eagle clenching lightning bolts in its talons. The agency it belonged to hadn't officially existed in over 15 years. Arkstone Division, a multinational tactical intervention unit so secretive it had been erased from official databases years ago. The badge had no expiration date. Just a name, a level, and a past tied to more silent operations than most governments dared admit. And while it wouldn't open doors at a civilian terminal anymore, it could still open conversations, especially with people who knew what to look for. Jonas scanned the aisle. All was calm. He reached under his coffee cup, retrieving a napkin and the pen from the seat-back pocket. In small, sharp handwriting, he wrote, "Not him pilot. Watch co-pilot. Act normal." He folded the napkin with practiced precision and tucked it into his palm. As Mira came by with the beverage cart, their fingers brushed, just briefly, when he handed over his empty cup. The napkin passed between them with the smooth choreography of two people speaking in a language without sound. A handoff performed countless times over the years, across embassies, secure zones, and international summits. She didn't look at the note, didn't falter, just nodded politely and moved on, resuming her duties with professional ease. But Jonas saw it, the slight tension in her shoulders, the tightening around her eyes. She understood. Message received. 3 minutes later, Mira returned from the galley with a tray of drinks. She moved slowly, watching, studying. Her routine unchanged, but her awareness sharpened. Jonas observed how her gaze lingered on the cockpit door every time she passed the front of the aircraft. He watched how she subtly repositioned herself to catch a better glimpse toward the flight deck without drawing suspicion. She'd seen the co-pilot, of course. Everyone had during boarding. Mid-40s. Neatly groomed, clean uniform. Unremarkable in every way, except for how silent he had been. He hadn't said a word during the safety briefing. No friendly banter with the passengers. No casual remarks to the crew. And more than 5 hours in, he had yet to step into the aisle. That wasn't routine. As Mira passed Jonas again, she gently slid a new cup of water onto his tray. Beneath it, folded neatly, was a napkin. 3 words. Same handwriting. Same ink. Cockpit door locked. Jonas's jaw tensed. That wasn't standard. Yes, cockpit doors were always secured during flight, but they weren't meant to be sealed beyond access. In non-emergency situations, both pilots should be able to enter and exit freely. A fully locked door, one that couldn't be opened from the outside, meant someone inside didn't want to be interrupted. That was something else entirely. The puzzle pieces had been floating in his mind for the past hour. Now they clicked together. A co-pilot who never left his seat. A captain who hadn't been seen since takeoff. A disabled camera meant to watch the cockpit door. A door that was sealed tight. Jonas had seen this scenario before, not in real time, but in debriefs, in strategy reports, in simulation after simulation. This wasn't the start of a threat. This was after the breach. The cabin wasn't waiting for danger. The plane was already under its control. He shifted his posture subtly, studying the aisles again, with the precision of someone trained to assess risks like a grandmaster calculating endgames. Every step, every breath in the cabin was now part of a larger equation. This wasn't about preventing something. It was about reclaiming control. Jonas Creel sat motionless, but his mind moved at blistering speed. He catalogued every detail, every shift in energy inside the cabin. From tray movements to blinking seatbelt signs to the subtle repositioning of passengers in their sleep, he saw it all. His thoughts ran parallel, stacked in layers, predicting, calculating, adapting. 3 air marshals were likely on this flight. That was standard protocol for Nimbus Air's transatlantic night routes. But they'd be watching for the wrong threat. A nervous man with a weapon, maybe a physical assault, maybe someone standing up and shouting. They wouldn't be looking at the cockpit. They wouldn't imagine that the danger had already passed the threshold. The wolf wasn't waiting at the gate. He was already inside the sheepfold. Then, barely noticeable to anyone else, Flight 721 made a minor course correction. Nothing dramatic, just a few degrees difference. But Jonas felt it in the way his body leaned slightly into the seat. He saw the subtle shift in the stars beyond his window. They were drifting off the assigned flight path. Not enough to alarm the control tower, not yet, but enough to matter. That was when it happened. Colin Brayer, The man in 11A suddenly lurched upward. He swayed in the aisle, his face pale, his eyes glassy. His chest rose and fell in panicked bursts. He stumbled, bumping into a seated passenger, then a flight attendant carrying drinks. Coffee splashed across the aisle. Gasps broke the quiet. Passengers sat upright. Seatbelts clicked open. Colin clutched his chest, staggering sideways. "My heart," he wheezed. I need my medication." It was a performance, but a convincing one. Mira rushed forward. Another crew member followed with the medical kit. Passengers craned their necks. Someone asked if there was a doctor on board. The ripple spread through the cabin. Chaos, but controlled chaos. And it was exactly what the co-pilot had been waiting for. The cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out, concern written on his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes sweeping the growing commotion. He took one step into the cabin. One step was all it took. From his seat in the cockpit, the co-pilot moved. Jonas saw it all unfold like a scene in a slowed-down film. The co-pilot rising with sudden energy. The flash of something in his hand, small, metallic, not a firearm, but something worse for close quarters. A blade? A syringe? A final adjustment to the flight controls before abandoning the seat. He wasn't investigating. He was securing. He was reaching for the door controls, ready to lock himself inside, sealing out the crew, sealing in whatever plan had begun 5 hours ago. Near the galley, Miralenko saw it too. Her eyes widened in horror as comprehension swept over her like a crashing wave. "Captain!" she shouted, but her voice was lost beneath the chaos, the scramble, the calls for help, the cries of concern. The co-pilot's fingers were inches from the locking mechanism, and that's when Jonas moved. No hesitation, no delay. His body became pure instinct, decades of field training refined into exact purpose. He was off the ground before most people had even turned their heads. He cut across the aisle in 3 long strides, brushing past a stunned flight attendant. His right hand snatched a metal serving tray from the galley as he passed. It wasn't dinnerware anymore. It was a shield. The co-pilot saw him at the last second. Recognition. Shock. Then alarm. His hand lunged toward the locking mechanism as the cockpit door began to swing shut. Jonas slammed the tray into the narrowing gap. Metal screeched against metal. The motor struggled, whining in protest, trying to seal the door, but the tray held it open just long enough. With a powerful kick, Jonas drove his foot into the lower hinge. The door burst open. The cockpit lay revealed, glowing with digital indicators and LED-lit panels. Flight data danced across screens. Their position over the Atlantic glowed in green on the map. And there, rising fully from the co-pilot's seat, the threat made flesh. The co-pilot turned to face him, his face twisted into rage. From his sleeve, he pulled an 8-inch ceramic blade, ghostly white, sharp as razors, and invisible to airport metal detectors. "Step back," he hissed. Jonas moved faster. His eyes scanned the space. His hand grabbed the headset cord dangling near the door. He coiled it quickly around his palm, turning it into a makeshift weapon. The co-pilot lunged. Jonas sidestepped, smooth, precise. The blade slashed past him, missing flesh but grazing his sleeve. Jonas twisted, using the attacker's momentum against him, a textbook redirection maneuver. With one swift loop, Jonas wrapped the headset cord around the man's wrist and yanked hard, driving the knife hand down into the console. The blade hit the instrument panel with a clang and tumbled to the floor. The co-pilot snarled and tried to punch free, but Jonas had already shifted his weight, pinning the arm. He secured the other wrist in a quick, brutal movement, locking both arms against the control bank. Seat belt. The word came quiet, level, almost casual. Jonas Creel kept the co-pilot pinned against the control panel with one arm while addressing the stunned man in the doorway, Captain Ellery Vaughn, still frozen in shock. His brow was furrowed, mouth half open, eyes darting between Jonas and the restrained man. Finally, the captain blinked, snapped into action. He unclasped his belt with trembling fingers and handed it over. Jonas worked quickly. Movements practiced, smooth, efficient. First the wrists, tight and secure. Then a second headset cord looped around the co-pilot's ankles. The man squirmed, tried to twist free, but the restraints held. Jonas applied pressure to a nerve cluster just below the skull. The co-pilot's muscles slackened instantly. Limbs heavy. Mouth silent. "Who are you?" the captain whispered. Eyes wide. Jonas glanced at him, expression unreadable. Just a passenger. But as he turned back to the flight controls, it was clear he was far more than that. He scanned the systems. The course had been shifted, subtly, but enough to take them into restricted airspace. Communications had been tampered with. Transponder codes changed. External updates blocked. "He was taking us north," Jonas said. The captain's mouth opened as the pieces began clicking into place. "Toward," Jonas nodded. "Velgren airspace." Not a sightseeing detour. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 20 seconds. From the moment Jonas had risen from seat 17B to the instant the co-pilot was neutralized, less time had passed than it would take most people to choose between tea or ginger ale. Behind them, the cabin remained unaware, still caught in the aftermath of the staged medical emergency. Flight attendants knelt beside Colin Brayer, who had collapsed into dramatic spasms just minutes earlier. Most passengers were standing or craning to see what was happening. A few recorded on their phones. Some simply stared. Near the galley, Miralenko stood still, her eyes fixed on Jonas through the open cockpit door. Their gazes met. One nod, silent understanding, gratitude, relief, respect. And then he was gone. Back in the cabin, Jonas returned to his seat with the same quiet presence he'd had since boarding. Nothing in his face gave away the storm he'd just passed through. His hands relaxed, his eyes calm. A voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Vaughn. We've had a small incident with one of our crew members who is feeling unwell. The situation is under control. We'll be continuing to our destination without delay. We apologize for any inconvenience." It was delivered perfectly, professional, composed, and deeply reassuring. Exactly what the passengers needed. What they didn't know? That announcement came exactly 9 minutes after Jonas had stopped their flight from becoming international news. In those 9 minutes, the co-pilot had been restrained and sedated. 2 air marshals, now fully briefed, were posted at the crew rest area to guard him. The flight path had been restored. Ground control was discreetly notified using coded phrases, minimizing attention. The cabin had begun settling. Mira took her place again, moving calmly through the rows. Colin, now lucid and exhausted, sat back in 11A, flushed and quiet. The attack of panic, rooted in flight anxiety and medication withdrawal, had passed. He'd never know that his condition had been the perfect decoy, a man whose distress had been real but unintentionally orchestrated into a cover for something far worse. Passengers murmured, speculating over the scare. A few complained about coffee on their clothes. Others returned to their screens. Some had never even looked up. No one realized just how close Flight 721 had come to never reaching Grunwald. 30 minutes later, as the beverage cart rolled out again, Mira paused briefly at row 17B. "Coffee, sir?" she asked, voice steady now, but the seat was empty. Jonas had moved to the rear of the plane, seated with the air marshals in a private row. There, under hushed conversation, he explained what he had observed and how he had acted. He presented the Arkstone Division badge, faded but unmistakable. The senior marshal listened without interruption. He nodded slowly, asked only a few questions. Jonas answered each with quiet, deliberate precision. By the time the aircraft began its descent, every trace of what had occurred was contained. The cockpit was secure, the co-pilot sedated, the passengers none the wiser. They'd land as scheduled, safe and unshaken, none of them aware that the man in 17B had just derailed a covert operation that could have ended in disaster. The Grunwald International Security Office was stark and cold. Concrete walls, utilitarian furniture, and a small room with 4 chairs. The only decoration, the crimson emblem of the Federal Security Bureau. Miralenko sat upright, hands folded, recounting the night. 2 officers, faces expressionless, listened carefully. She gave her account without drama, her voice even. A factual, clean report. Every detail in order. No embellishment. "And this passenger who intervened," the female officer said at last, "he identified himself as former intelligence?" "Yes," Mira said. "He showed a credential to the air marshals. I didn't see it myself." "And where is he now?" Mira hesitated. After landing, there'd been chaos. The captain was whisked into debrief. The co-pilot, sedated and cuffed, escorted to a secure vehicle. The passengers streamed out toward customs. But Jonas? Gone. Disappeared into the crowd. "I don't know," she admitted softly. Her statement was clear, precise. No added flair. Just a clean sequence of facts delivered in crisp order. "And this passenger, the one who intervened?" the female security officer asked, not looking up from her notepad. Her accent was tight, her voice efficient, like everything else in the gray-walled interview room. "You say he identified himself as former intelligence?" Miralenko nodded. "Yes. He showed his credentials to the air marshals. I didn't see them personally." "And his current whereabouts?" Mira hesitated. After landing, everything had moved fast. The co-pilot had been escorted off the plane under sedation. The captain, still rattled, was pulled into a high-level debrief. The passengers had flowed out toward baggage claim, most unaware of what had truly happened mid-flight. But Jonas Creel, he had vanished into the crowd as easily as he'd stepped forward to stop a hijacking. "I don't know," she said quietly. The 2 officers exchanged a glance. Not surprise, not confusion. Something else. Confirmation. As if this was exactly the kind of exit they'd expected from a man like him. "That will be all for now, Miss Lenko," the woman said, closing her notepad. "We'll contact you if we need additional details." As Mira stood to leave, the door opened. A 3rd official entered. He was older, with silver in his hair, and the demeanor of someone who didn't need rank insignia to project authority. He held out a manila envelope without explanation. "For you," he said simply. Outside in the corridor, beneath the flat glow of institutional lighting, Mira opened it. Inside was a white porcelain coffee cup, the one from the flight, clean now, sterile. No message hidden in ink, no traces of the moment it had carried. Wrapped inside the tissue was a second item, a luggage tag, the kind used on carry-ons. On it, in careful block letters, a handwritten note. "Don't change 17B next time." Mira stared at it for a long moment. 1,000 emotions coursed through her: relief, wonder, disbelief, and a new sense of something else. Resolve? From the doorway, the older official watched her, his face unreadable. "You have good instincts," he said. Then, after a pause, "That's rare and valuable." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Mira alone with a single coffee cup, a message, and a dawning sense that her path had just taken a sharp turn. 1 week later, she stood once again in the rear galley of another long-haul overnight. Flight 982, bound for Grünwald. Different aircraft, different crew, same route, same sky. Mira's eyes swept the cabin as she moved through her pre-service checks. She noticed the same subtle cues, the twitch of a businessman's fingers in first class, the off-duty pilot dozing in row 4, the young couple who boarded separately but sat together as soon as the door closed. As she pushed the beverage cart forward, her steps paused at row 17B. The seat was unoccupied. Still, she placed a cup of coffee on the tray table. Steam rose gently, curling up into the cabin's recycled air. It drifted upward like a memory. From behind her, the new senior flight attendant, Rena, frowned slightly. "That row's empty." Mira offered a small smile. "Just a habit." They continued on. The cart moved forward. Passengers made quiet requests for tea, wine, sparkling water. But Mira looked back once. The coffee cup sat untouched, a solitary sentinel in an empty seat, and somehow just its presence made the cabin feel safer, like it was watching, like the man who had once filled that seat was still with them, in spirit, if not in body. The flight passed without incident, smooth, uneventful, quiet, just as a flight should be. As they touched down the next morning in Grünwald, Mira returned to collect the cup. It was empty, but beneath it, folded neatly on a napkin, was a note, the same handwriting. Sharp. Blocked. Row 22, Blue Jacket. Watch his hands. Mira's gaze swept down the aisle. She found him instantly. A man in a navy blazer, fidgeting with something in his pocket. Sitting alone. Restless eyes. She straightened her uniform. Some heroes wore capes. Others left cryptic notes and half-finished coffee. And high above the Atlantic, in the thin air where routine met danger, both kinds kept watch, ensuring that ordinary flights stayed ordinary, even when they weren't.